The HOA compliance chair reached for my service dog's leash before the elevator doors had even closed. Atlas pressed against my left leg, perfectly still, while Elaine Porter planted herself between us and the lobby exit. Behind her, a bored volunteer held up a phone with its camera pointed directly at my face. "Pets are prohibited inside this building. Remove him now." I didn't pull away or raise my voice. I kept one hand on Atlas's harness, looked at the phone, and asked whether they were recording an official HOA enforcement action. Elaine smiled and said the footage would prove my dog was dangerous. "Pet?" Then Atlas nudged my wrist, the medical alert he had been trained to give, and guided me toward the bench beside the mailroom. He never barked, lunged, or left my side. Their camera captured every second. It also captured a board member stepping into the lobby and reminding Elaine that my accommodation had already been approved. Elaine glanced at the phone and answered, "I know. I'm trying to make her stop bringing him out." That one sentence changed the purpose of their video. But the clipboard beneath Elaine's arm revealed something even worse. My unit number, my daily schedule, and 4 previous dates they had apparently been tracking. My name is Mara Ellis. I was 39, and until that morning, I had spent 18 months trying to be forgettable at Pine Hollow Townhomes. Atlas was the only reason anyone on the board had paid attention to me. While he kept his shoulder against my knee, I steadied my breathing and raised my phone. I photographed the clipboard before Elaine turned it against her chest. The dates were spaced across 5 weeks. Beside 2 of them were handwritten times that matched my usual trips to the mailroom. Elaine ordered the volunteer, Caleb Morris, to stop recording. He lowered the phone, but did not end the file immediately. I could still see the red timer moving near his thumb. Leonard Fields, the board member who had interrupted her, asked Elaine to step away from the elevator. She did, but only after sliding a red violation form onto the bench beside me. The box marked "aggressive animal" had already been checked. No incident time had been written in, even though the supposed incident was still happening. I photographed that too. "Please send me the complete original video," I said, "and identify the rule you believe I violated." Elaine tucked the clipboard under her blazer. She told me the property manager would contact me, then walked out through the side corridor with Caleb following behind her. Leonard stayed long enough to ask whether I needed help getting home. I told him Atlas had already handled that part. Before leaving, I looked up at the fixed security camera above the mailroom door. A small green light showed it was active. Elaine had brought her own camera to build a case against us, but the building had recorded her from another angle. By the time Atlas guided me across the courtyard, I had 4 photographs, 2 witnesses, and a promise that an official video existed. What I did not have was an explanation for the 4 dates on Elaine's clipboard, or any idea how many times she had been waiting for us before I finally noticed. Atlas had not entered my life because I wanted companionship, although he gave me plenty of that. 2 years earlier, I had collapsed in the produce aisle of a grocery store after a neurological episode scrambled my balance and left me unable to judge where the floor was beneath me. I recovered, but the episodes returned without enough warning for me to sit down safely. I stopped driving. Then I stopped shopping alone. My younger sister began crossing town twice a week to collect groceries and packages I had once handled myself. Eventually, I began measuring every trip outside by the distance to the nearest chair. Atlas changed that calculation. He had been trained to recognize the small physical changes that came before an episode. When he pressed his nose to my wrist, I knew I had time to sit. If I became disoriented, he positioned his body to create space and guided me toward a stable surface. He did not make the condition disappear. He made it possible for me to live without organizing every hour around the fear of falling. That was why Pine Hollow mattered. The townhome I rented had a ground-level entrance, a short route to the shared mailroom, and a courtyard I could cross without traffic. Before moving in, I submitted a written accommodation request through the property manager, June Keller. The supporting letter described the disability-related need without exposing my entire medical history. 3 weeks later, June emailed confirmation that Atlas could accompany me throughout the property, including the clubhouse and other common areas. For 18 months, there had been no incident. Atlas lay beneath my chair during 2 community meetings, ignored food dropped near him at the summer picnic, and waited quietly while children passed us in the mailroom. Elaine never welcomed him, but at first she limited herself to tight smiles and reminders that Pine Hollow prohibited pets inside shared buildings. The atmosphere changed after residents complained about two ordinary dogs being brought into the clubhouse. Elaine announced a strict enforcement campaign. Colored notices appeared on doors, fines were discussed at meetings, and she began telling neighbors that exceptions made the policy impossible to enforce. She never named me publicly, but her eyes usually found Atlas when she said it. The morning after the elevator confrontation, I received an email from June with the subject line, "Formal Animal Violation." The attached notice accused Atlas of blocking a director, displaying protective behavior, and creating a safety risk. It ordered me to keep him out of the clubhouse while the board conducted a review. A second violation, it warned, could result in fines and the suspension of my access privileges. I read it twice before opening the attached video. My hands were trembling badly enough that Atlas left his bed and rested his chin against my thigh. The clip lasted 43 seconds. It began after Elaine had already stepped between us and the elevator. Atlas stood at my left side while Caleb moved around behind me with the phone. Each time I angled toward the exit, Elaine shifted into the opening. When Caleb came close enough for his reflection to appear in the elevator doors, Atlas moved across my knees and created a barrier with his body. The notice described that motion as aggression. The video showed no bark, snap, lunge, or attempt to make contact. Near the end, Elaine leaned toward Caleb and pointed at Atlas. The recording was unsteady, but her instruction was clear. Move closer. We need the dog to do something. Atlas did exactly what he had been trained to do. He watched my balance, created space, and guided me to the bench. The clip ended before Leonard entered the lobby and before Elaine admitted she knew about the approval. I downloaded the attachment instead of forwarding it through the email application. I saved a second copy to an external drive, photographed the notice beside the time displayed on my computer, and wrote down everything I remembered while the sequence was still fresh. Only then did I look at the video's properties. The notice called it Dog Incident, Clubhouse. The original file name embedded in the attachment said something else. Removal. Attempt 4.mp4. I stared at the number until its meaning settled in. Elaine had not simply been waiting for Atlas to make a mistake that morning. If the file name was accurate, she had tried to manufacture that mistake 3 times before. Rachel Kim did not react to the file name the way I expected. She did not call it a confession or promise that one careless label would win anything. She asked me to send the original email in a format that preserved its headers, then told me not to contact Elaine, Caleb, or the board until she had reviewed the complete record. Rachel was a housing attorney with a small office above a pharmacy downtown. Atlas settled beneath the conference table while she compared the approval letter, June's confirmation email, the violation notice, and the video properties displayed on her monitor. "The label is a clue," she said. "The pattern is what matters." She explained that the HOA could investigate a genuine safety complaint. What it could not plausibly defend was knowingly interfering with an approved disability-related accommodation and manufacturing the conduct it claimed to be investigating. To determine which story the record supported, she needed the material created before, during, and after every encounter. That afternoon, Rachel sent Pine Hollow a preservation letter. It covered original video files, cloud storage records, emails, text messages, meeting notes, security footage, access logs, complaints, and drafts of the violation notice. It also demanded that the HOA preserve recordings from the fixed camera above the mailroom before the system automatically overwrote them. My assignment was less technical. I opened a blank notebook and built a timeline. The first clipboard date matched an afternoon when Elaine had stood outside the mailroom pretending to rearrange flyers. The second matched a morning when Caleb followed me across the courtyard with his phone held against his chest. I had noticed him then, but assumed he was reading a message. A third date lined up with a community coffee hour, where Elaine repeatedly asked whether Atlas became protective when strangers approached me. The memories felt different once they had numbers beside them. Moments I had dismissed as awkward now formed a sequence. Leonard agreed to speak with Rachel. He confirmed that the board had approved my accommodation without an expiration date and that no vote had ever reversed it. He also described a closed board discussion in which Elaine complained that Atlas made enforcement against ordinary pets look selective. Leonard had objected but assumed the issue ended there. His written statement did not prove everything, but it established that Elaine knew the approval remained active. June responded to Rachel 3 days later. She said Pine Hollow was investigating and called the file name an internal labeling error. She provided the 43-second clip we already possessed, but no earlier files. She also claimed the fixed security footage was unavailable because the lobby camera recorded only live images. That answer bothered me. I had once received a still image from the same camera after a package disappeared from the mailroom. I found the old email and sent it to Rachel. The image displayed a playback timestamp and a camera identifier. Rachel forwarded it to Pine Hollow with a request for the system's retention settings and vendor records. The response changed within 24 hours. The camera did record. More importantly, the relevant footage had not yet been overwritten. From the fixed angle above the mailroom, the confrontation looked even more deliberate. Caleb arrived 11 minutes before I did. Elaine pointed toward the elevator, moved him twice, and demonstrated where he should stand. When Atlas and I entered, they separated and waited. The recording had no useful audio, but it showed that their positions were planned before any supposed safety concern arose. 2 earlier dates produced similar scenes. On one, Caleb waited beside the courtyard gate and raised his phone as soon as Atlas appeared. On another, Elaine crossed the lobby 3 times to intercept our route. Atlas remained beside me in both recordings. The video files Pine Hollow eventually produced carried metadata linking them to a board-controlled cloud account. Their names followed the same pattern: removal, attempt 1, removal, attempt 2, and removal, attempt 3. Attempt 2 included a note stating, "No reaction, too much distance." Rachel warned me that we still needed to know who wrote the note, why the recordings were authorized, and whether the board had acted collectively or Elaine had used HOA resources on her own. But we no longer had a single disputed encounter. We had repeated preparation, tracking, and selective editing. She sent a formal cease and desist demand requiring Pine Hollow to withdraw the violation, confirm my access with Atlas, and stop directors or volunteers from staging further encounters. The board was given 5 business days to respond. On the 5th morning, no letter arrived. Instead, I crossed the courtyard to collect a package, pressed my access fob against the clubhouse reader, and watched the light turn red. I tried the fob again. The reader flashed red a second time. Through the glass doors, my package sat on the reception counter less than 20 feet away. June answered when I called the management office, but her voice had the careful flatness of someone reading from approved language. She said my clubhouse privileges had been suspended during an animal safety review. When I reminded her that the board had received Rachel's demand, she said the decision was temporary and applied only to discretionary amenities. The mailroom was not an amenity I could simply replace. Carrier deliveries too large for the outdoor boxes were held inside, and the safest route to those boxes passed through the lobby. June offered to have an employee bring the package to the door later. That did not restore access. It turned a routine task into something I needed permission and assistance to complete. I photographed the red reader and recorded the time. Atlas stood beside me, looking through the glass at the bench where he had alerted me 5 days earlier. By afternoon, a notice appeared on every community bulletin board. It reminded residents that animals connected to an active safety investigation could be restricted from common facilities. My name was absent, but there was only one animal under public investigation. A neighbor who had once asked to pet Atlas hurried her daughter past us without making eye contact. Another resident asked whether my dog had bitten someone. I answered no, then went home. For the next week, I collected mail after dusk. I avoided the courtyard when I saw anyone carrying a phone. When Atlas alerted me near the outdoor boxes one evening, I sat on the low brick border because the lobby bench was behind a locked door. My palms pressed into rough mortar while the courtyard tilted around me. Atlas braced across my knees and waited until I could focus again. My sister found me there when she arrived with groceries. She did not tell me to move, but she asked whether living at Pine Hollow was still worth it. I had no answer that did not feel like surrender. Atlas had helped me reclaim the ordinary parts of my life. Elaine had made those same ordinary moments feel like evidence being collected against me. Leonard called Rachel 2 days later. Elaine was asking the board to approve the access suspension retroactively and adopt an interim rule allowing directors to record any animal they considered suspicious. Leonard said 2 board members were uncomfortable, but Elaine argued that one exception could prevent the HOA from enforcing its no-pet rule against anyone. That was the first time her position made sense to me, even though it did not excuse what she had done. Elaine did not see Atlas's work. She saw a hole in a rule she wanted to keep simple. If she could recast him as a threat, she would not have to explain why treating every animal identically could produce an unequal result for the person who depended on one. Rachel's response separated legitimate enforcement from what the records showed. The board could address an animal that actually posed a safety problem. It could not create confrontations, mislabel trained behavior, and then use the manufactured record to defeat an accommodation it had already approved. June began producing documents after Rachel warned that continued withholding would become part of the complaint. Buried in a monthly expense report was a $286 purchase for a phone stabilizer and expanded cloud storage. Elaine had submitted it under compliance documentation. The purchase date was 8 days before removal attempt 1. Archived minutes from a closed board work session were worse. Elaine had proposed controlled encounters to evaluate the animal's response in shared spaces. Leonard's objection appeared in one sentence. No vote authorizing the plan appeared anywhere. Then Rachel received an email Elaine had sent to Caleb and 2 other volunteers. It included my usual mailroom window and instructed them to approach from different angles while filming. The final line read, "Continue until we document protective behavior." Caleb replied with a single question. "Has legal approved this?" Elaine never answered in writing. The email did not transform every unresolved issue into a certainty. We still needed testimony about who participated, whether the full board knew, and what had happened to the unedited recordings. But it connected the equipment purchase, the meeting proposal, my schedule, and the staged encounters in Elaine's own account. Rachel gave Pine Hollow one last opportunity to reactivate my fob, withdraw the violation, correct its records, and prohibit further targeted recording. Its attorney responded that the board had acted out of safety concerns and denied discriminatory intent. The letter offered temporary package delivery but left the access suspension in place. The following morning, Rachel filed a housing discrimination complaint and a civil action seeking immediate restoration of my access and protection from retaliation. She did not promise me a fast ending. She told me the next stage would involve formal requests, sworn answers, and people being required to explain records they had written when they thought no one outside Pine Hollow would ever read them. That evening, the red notice disappeared from the bulletin board. My fob still did not work. The HOA's formal response arrived 3 weeks later. It did not deny that the recordings existed. Instead, it argued that Elaine had been responding to resident concerns about Atlas's size and protective positioning. The board described the filming as ordinary documentation and claimed the clubhouse restriction was a temporary precaution, not punishment for requesting an accommodation. On paper, the argument sounded calmer than the conduct it defended. That mattered. Rachel warned me not to underestimate it. A board responsible for shared facilities could investigate a specific safety concern, and Elaine would likely say every decision had been made to protect residents. Our task was to show why that explanation did not fit the chronology. Through formal requests, Rachel sought the original recording devices, the complete cloud folders, director communications, complaint records, and every version of Pine Hollow's animal policies. The HOA produced hundreds of pages, many repetitive and harmless. Rachel made me understand that evidence rarely arrived arranged like a confession. We had to compare dates, attachments, and edits until the gaps became visible. One gap involved Caleb. Elaine's email had assigned him to film removal attempt 4, but the HOA's written response described him as a resident who happened to witness the encounter. Under sworn questioning, Caleb admitted Elaine had selected the time and location. She had shown him where to stand, handed him an HOA-owned phone, and told him to keep Mara and Atlas centered in the frame. He looked miserable as he answered. Caleb was 26 and had volunteered because he hoped board service would help him qualify for a property management job. Elaine told him that Atlas had previously threatened residents and that the board needed clear footage before someone was injured. He said he believed he was documenting an existing danger. Then Rachel asked what Elaine told him when Atlas remained calm. Caleb stared at his hands. She said to close the distance until he showed protective behavior. He authenticated the phone, the cloud account, and the naming pattern. He also revealed that the 43-second attachment was not the full recording. Caleb had begun filming while Elaine arranged their positions and continued until after Leonard entered the lobby. He had uploaded an uninterrupted file lasting 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The HOA had produced only the shortened clip because, according to June, she initially received an edited export from Elaine. Once Caleb identified the original folder, Rachel demanded another search. The complete file appeared in an automatically synchronized archive. It began with Elaine directing Caleb toward the elevator. She stepped backward, studied the frame on his phone, and repositioned him beside a planter. When I entered, the video captured every time Elaine moved to block my route. It captured Atlas remaining quiet. It captured her instruction to move closer, his medical alert, Leonard's arrival, and the admission that she already knew my accommodation was approved. It also captured what happened after I left. Leonard told Elaine that the encounter had crossed a line. Elaine answered that the board could not enforce a no-pet policy while residents watched Atlas use the clubhouse every day. Her problem was not an uncontrolled animal. It was the visible existence of an exception she did not want to explain. June's testimony supplied the next link. She confirmed that she had warned Elaine in writing before the first recording. The approval remained valid. No formal complaint described a bite, lunge, or contact, and management had recommended handling any question through the existing accommodation process. Elaine replied that the board needed behavioral evidence before it could reconsider the approval. The policy history showed why. 2 days after removal attempt 3, Elaine circulated a draft rule allowing the HOA to suspend any animal accommodation based on perceived defensive behavior. It contained no standard for who made that judgment and no process for reviewing the surrounding circumstances. The draft date came after the campaign began, but Elaine's later board memo described it as the rule governing all 4 encounters. That contradiction divided the directors. Leonard and another member refused to sign a statement supporting Elaine's account. A third director said he had believed the recordings involved ordinary pet violations and had never authorized tracking my schedule. In a special meeting, the board voted to suspend Elaine's enforcement authority while the litigation continued. She remained compliance chair in name, but she could no longer issue notices, direct volunteers, or access security records. Pine Hollow's attorney then proposed a resolution. The HOA would reactivate my fob, withdraw the current violation, and confirm that Atlas could enter the clubhouse. In exchange, I would dismiss both proceedings, release all related claims, and agree not to discuss the recordings publicly. The proposal did not require removal of earlier internal incident entries, prohibit future targeted filming, reimburse expenses, or correct the policy Elaine had tried to create. For one night, I considered accepting it. I wanted my key to work. I wanted to collect a package without reporting the trip to my attorney. My sister reminded me that those were things I had possessed before Elaine took them away. Rachel rejected the proposal, but left the door open to mediation after Pine Hollow restored access and addressed the complete record. When the HOA refused, she moved forward with our request for temporary relief. The hearing was set for a Monday morning. On Sunday evening, Rachel called to say Pine Hollow had finally produced the archived 4-minute video in its native format. Its attorney had seen the last 40 seconds for the first time that afternoon. Those 40 seconds showed Elaine looking directly into the HOA's own camera and telling Caleb what she planned to do if Atlas never reacted. The final 40 seconds did not contain shouting or a dramatic confession. That made them harder to dismiss. After Leonard challenged her, Elaine waited until he walked toward the management office. Then she leaned beside Caleb's phone and spoke in the measured tone she used during board meetings. If the dog never reacts, we classify the body blocking as protective behavior and recommend removal anyway. Caleb asked whether she wanted him to keep recording. Elaine said no. They already had enough to write the notice. The next morning, Rachel and I entered the courthouse through a side door with Atlas walking at my left knee. The hearing was not a trial, and Rachel reminded me that the judge would not decide every disputed fact. We were asking for temporary access while the larger case proceeded, and for an order preventing the HOA from staging or directing further encounters. Pine Hollow's attorney began with the argument Rachel had anticipated. The HOA had a duty to investigate resident safety concerns. Atlas was a large animal trained to place himself between me and approaching people. Elaine, the attorney said, may have used poor language, but the board had acted cautiously after observing behavior it believed could escalate in a confined lobby. The attorney emphasized that I had not been banned from my home. Packages could be delivered to my door, outdoor mailboxes remained available, and the fob suspension was temporary. He described the dispute as a disagreement over risk management, rather than interference with an accommodation. Rachel did not argue that Pine Hollow lacked all authority to address safety. She started with chronology. June's approval email established that Atlas had used the common areas for 18 months. The complaint log contained no report of a bite, lunge, snap, or unwanted contact during that period. The equipment invoice showed that Elaine purchased the stabilizer and cloud storage before attempt 1. The meeting minutes documented her proposal for controlled encounters. Her email supplied my routine and told volunteers to approach from multiple angles. The fixed security footage showed Elaine and Caleb arranging their positions before I arrived. Then Caleb testified. He identified the HOA-owned phone and explained how its files synchronized automatically to the board's cloud account. He confirmed that no resident had approached him during attempt 4 to report an immediate threat. Elaine gave him the location and time, directed his camera position, and told him to move closer when Atlas remained calm. He also confirmed that Atlas never touched him. The HOA's attorney asked whether Atlas deliberately placed his body between me and the camera. Caleb said yes. For a moment, that answer seemed to support Pine Hollow's description. Rachel asked the next question. Had Caleb been moving toward me after Elaine instructed him to provoke a response? Yes, he said. Rachel played the unedited recording. I watched myself enter the lobby without knowing 2 people had prepared for my arrival. I watched Elaine close the first opening, Caleb circle behind me, and Atlas detect the change in my balance before I fully understood it myself. The courtroom was quiet as he pressed his nose to my wrist and guided me toward the bench. Seeing it on a large screen felt more exposing than the confrontation had. My medical episode, my shaking hand, and the moment I depended on Atlas were no longer private. I kept one palm on the edge of the table. Beneath it, Atlas rested his chin on my shoe. The recording continued past the shortened clip. Leonard entered. Elaine admitted she knew the accommodation was approved. Then came the final exchange about calling Atlas's trained positioning dangerous whether he reacted or not. Rachel did not ask the judge to treat that sentence alone as the entire case. She connected it to the prepared notice, which already had aggressive animal checked before the encounter ended, the cloud files named as removal attempts, the hidden earlier footage, the retroactive draft policy, and the fob suspension imposed after the preservation demand. June authenticated the access records. She acknowledged that management had warned Elaine to use the existing accommodation review process. She also confirmed that no formal board vote authorized surveillance of my schedule before the recordings began. Leonard testified last. He described Elaine's concern that residents would challenge ordinary pet fines if they saw Atlas in the clubhouse. He admitted he should have demanded that the board stop her after the first discussion, instead of assuming his objection was enough. The judge did not announce a final finding of discrimination. She said the evidence raised serious questions about whether the stated safety rationale matched the HOA's actual conduct, and whether restricting my access caused ongoing harm. She ordered Pine Hollow to reactivate my fob, recognize the existing accommodation while the case proceeded, and refrain from directing officers, volunteers, or employees to follow, confront, or specially record me outside generally applicable security systems. The order was temporary, but the effect was immediate. June reactivated my fob before we left the courthouse. Pine Hollow requested mediation within a week. By then, 2 directors had formally asked Elaine to resign as compliance chair, and the HOA faced continued document production, witness costs, and scrutiny of every edited recording. Still, mediation was not simple. The board wanted confidentiality and no admission of liability. I wanted more than access restored until the next leadership change. Rachel organized our demands around what the evidence could support. Every violation and internal incident label connected to Atlas had to be removed. Pine Hollow needed a written accommodation process, training for directors and management staff, and a prohibition against targeted recording disguised as enforcement. The settlement also had to address the weeks I lost access, the medical and practical effects of the campaign, and the legal expense required to reverse it. The HOA pushed back on money and refused at first to remove Elaine permanently from enforcement. Its representatives argued that individual directors changed and no settlement could control every future disagreement. Rachel answered with procedures, written review standards, documented complaints, neutral decision-makers, and a rule that an approved accommodation could not be suspended merely because someone described trained behavior as uncomfortable. After 11 hours, the mediator carried a final term sheet into our room. Pine Hollow would remove the records, preserve my access with Atlas, adopt the policy changes, complete training, and bar Elaine from any compliance or accommodation role. The HOA would pay $28,000 in compensation and $7,400 toward negotiated legal expenses. In return, I would resolve the pending claims without requiring the board to admit liability publicly. I signed because the agreement did not ask me to pretend the recordings had never happened. It required Pine Hollow to change what made them possible. 3 weeks later, I stood with Atlas outside the same clubhouse doors. The red violation notice was gone. Elaine's name had been removed from the compliance chair plaque. I raised my fob toward the reader, uncertain whether I was ready to walk back through the place where their camera had turned my disability into a test. The reader turned green before I could prepare myself for another red light. The lock released, and Atlas waited until I opened the door before moving forward. No one blocked the elevator. No phone rose from behind a planter. Inside, June met me beside the reception counter. She handed me a printed account history showing that the animal violation, the safety review entry, and the access suspension had been removed. She also gave me the final accommodation policy adopted by the board. Future concerns had to be documented through management, evaluated from actual conduct, and reviewed by someone who had not participated in the complaint. An approved accommodation could not be suspended merely because trained positioning made another resident uncomfortable. The settlement funds arrived in 2 payments, $28,000 to compensate for the loss of access and the harm caused by the campaign, and $7,400 toward the legal expense required to stop it. The money mattered, especially after months of bills, but it was not the part I checked each morning. I checked whether my fob remained active. It did. Pine Hollow's directors and management employees completed accommodation training over the next 60 days. The board also adopted a rule prohibiting officers and volunteers from targeting individual residents for recording outside ordinary security procedures. The phone stabilizer disappeared from the compliance cabinet, and access to the cloud archive was limited to management. A week later, I attended my first community meeting since the suspension. Atlas slept beneath my chair while the board discussed landscaping for 20 minutes. The boredom felt strangely precious. Ordinary life had returned without anyone granting it as a favor. Elaine resigned as compliance chair under the settlement terms. 2 months later, she left the board entirely. I still saw her occasionally near the parking lot. She never apologized, and I did not require one to pass her without changing direction. Leonard apologized enough for both of them. He found me in the courtyard one afternoon and admitted that he had recognized the danger in Elaine's proposal, but treated his objection as the end of his responsibility. I told him his testimony mattered. I also told him it would have mattered more 5 weeks earlier. He nodded and did not ask me to make the truth easier for him. Caleb sent a short letter through Rachel. He wrote that wanting Elaine's approval had made him ignore how frightened I looked behind his camera. I believed him. Forgiving his mistake did not require pretending it had been harmless. On my first morning back, Atlas and I stopped beside the same mailroom bench. He nudged my wrist, and I sat while the familiar tilt passed through the floor. A woman collecting a package noticed, gave us space, and continued with her morning. Nothing became a spectacle. No one interpreted Atlas's movement for an audience. When I was steady, we crossed the lobby toward the elevator. The fixed security camera remained above the door, its green light still visible. I no longer saw it as Elaine's weapon. Her own recordings had exposed what she tried to hide because Atlas never gave her the reaction she needed. He had simply done his job. Atlas guided me through the front doors and into the courtyard. For the first time in months, I did not look over my shoulder for a camera. I looked ahead and let him lead me home.